Marathon's an old game. It predates the internet as we now know it. But even back then, its story was being discussed in depth on internet news groups, Usenet and the like, a sort of mimetic ancestor to the content you're currently enjoying. Point being that despite Marathon's relative obscurity, it's had many more years than most games for wild theories and speculation to brew, and with that sort of thing invariably comes a degree of inaccuracy. Furthermore, a lot of surface-level interest in these games has developed recently in response to Bungie's plans for a new game bearing the title, and a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon, excited for what Bungie's doing next without really taking careful consideration towards the stories of these games. The time is ripe for inaccuracies about the games to proliferate, and I'm going to talk about a few misconceptions that I've heard more than once. By the way, probably goes without saying, but gonna be a lot of spoilers here. Number 1, the protagonist is a Marine. The most widespread misconception I can think of. Many refer to the protagonist of the Marathon trilogy as a Marine, or simply the Marine. He's referred to as such in a lot of wiki pages I've seen, video essays, and even older discussions about the games. However, he's never called that in the games. In fact, Space Marines aren't really a concept that's discussed at all in Marathon. Certainly not by name, and the Marathon herself is not host to any kind of military detachment as far as we know. Mjolnir cyborgs aside. What reason would there be for Marines to be aboard the Marathon? This wasn't an amphibious assault ship attacking an alien stronghold. It was a colony ship, and not one that expected to need a military defense force. So pretty much everyone aboard the Marathon was a civilian or some kind of security guard. The manual makes it clear that the protagonist is seemingly an ordinary security officer, not a Marine. I think part of why people think he's a Marine comes down to the genre. There's a guy in space with a space helmet shooting aliens, so it follows that he's a space soldier, or one might say a Marine of sorts. And to their credit, the game doesn't really do much to contradict that. It doesn't really say he's a security officer in the actual games, which don't really dwell on the protagonist's day job. This isn't Halo, where you're part of an organized military command structure and thus constantly addressed by your rank. This is like you're a mall cop whose workplace is being besieged by Soviet paratroopers. For how relevant being a security officer is, it's kind of every man for himself. And for the most part, normal operational command has disintegrated before the game's even started. So to someone who didn't know better, it's pretty understandable why their mind would go straight to Space Marine. Only in the Marathon 1 manual is it actually explicitly stated that the character is a security officer. You know, hardly anybody reads that stuff. That said, while the man being referred to as a Marine might seem completely random based on what we do get out of the games, there is a prime suspect for where this originated. In the Shapes files, the player character's sprite set is referred to as Marine. Now, that might seem to contradict what I've said and lend some credence to the idea, but I don't like relying on that kind of under-the-hood information all by itself. Probably just an artifact of an idea that was abandoned in the story we know. Marathon underwent some pretty big changes to its story during development, and odds are they weren't changing the names for the sprites as much as they were revising the story. Interestingly enough, the Marathon Infinity manual actually does call the player character a Marine. Not in the context of the story though. The story blurb near the start uses the term security officer, but deep down in the innards of the Forge tutorial, they do make a reference to a Marine, so it would seem that Bungie, or perhaps Double A, made this same mistake, so I think we can forgive people for this one. Number 2. She is the Dark, O Lethe. The famous KYT, Kill Your Television Terminal as it's called, puts a sort of epic spin on the story of Marathon, reframing this story about an interstellar war into something of an allegory for the concept of heroism. But one thing people, especially the wiki and story page enjoyers out there, might not know is that when you actually find this in the game, it's not presented clearly. It's all one giant string of text with no spaces. If you've read this excerpt and understood its meaning, what you've likely seen was a reformatted version that shows the proper way to read this, with added spaces and punctuation, and the removal or replacement of a number of junk characters. Anything that isn't a lowercase letter is either noise or a character that has been switched, and there are quite a few scattered across the text. Dealing with all of those gets us the familiar story about Roland, Beowulf, Achilles, Gilgamesh, and so on. Now let's look at the excerpt that says, "She is the dark, O Lethe." In the original, Lethe appears with the L as a capital letter. Any formatted text you'll find will reasonably dispense with every other instance of a capital letter, which means that this L probably shouldn't be there, or that it should be something else. Now Lethe might seem like an appropriate reference. It refers to one of the 5 rivers of Hades, the river of forgetfulness, and Marathon is full of Greek analogies and references as is, including the title, and the "O Lethe" exclamation might seem appropriate given the text's poetic quality. However, Lethe doesn't really seem like a sensible analogy to just drop in the middle of this epic heroism context. If this was about, Thermopylae or Spartans or something, I might not hinge so much upon one letter being capital or not. But the river of forgetfulness seems really out of place in this little story. What I think this said was, "She is the Dark One." The capital letter L is flipped for a lowercase n. It's a much simpler explanation as to why that would be there, and it seems to align more thematically closely to the rest of the text. These two are eternally, diametrically opposed counteracting forces, good and evil, the hero and his foe, yin and yang. Where does the mythical river of forgetfulness factor into something like that? Also, "She is the Dark One" is just more probable syntax to come across than "O Lethe." Thus, instead of "She is the dark, O Lethe, enemy and lover," it is "She is the Dark One, the enemy and lover." Number 3, assimilated Bobs are humans. Maybe. There's some confusion with the term assimilated Bobs, and it goes with the notion that these things are people that have been robbed of their humanity and turned into monsters that explode. So, the Explodabobs, the simulacra, are referred to as assimilated Bobs in the shapes files of the game, which leads people down that line of thought. When you hear assimilated in the context of a sci-fi infiltrator that these ruthless alien slavers are using to infiltrate and kill people, the natural frame of reference is stuff like the Borg or body snatchers. These are what assimilate people, and they do it by taking humans and hollowing them out or absorbing them or something. However, there's a couple things to note about that theory. First off, they're only rarely referred to as assimilated in-game. Now, these things aren't really talked about very much, but they're usually just called simulacrums, which is technically not the proper plural form, but that's just being pedantic. Being a simulacrum would imply that they're an imitation, not a corruption of the real thing. The other important thing is that assimilated has multiple definitions. It doesn't just mean to be horrifically transmogrified. It also means to become a part of something, like assimilating into another culture, or spies can be covertly assimilated into a population, and that seems like the most relevant definition here. To be fair, Marathon does habitually use the word assimilated to refer to AIs being absorbed or transmogrified, but never really people. The game is kind of inconsistent with how it describes these things anyway. In 2 back-to-back terminals from the same guy, Blake, they are alternatively referred to as assimilated humans, cyborgs, and androids, 3 words that have very different connotations. Assimilated humans makes it sound like the human part is genuine. Borg theory. Cyborg is pretty ambiguous. While it usually means a human installed with robotic parts, it could also refer to the inverse, a robot with flesh and blood. An android, of course, implies that they're not organic to begin with. So to some extent, the confusion is due to a lack of consistency from the game itself, which means we can't really be sure who's right in this case. Still, given all the distinctly non-human features they have, it's hard to imagine that the 4 would take a human, turn them into something so aberrant, and then use them as an infiltrator. Like, why would they have 2 toes and red eyes? Instead, they come off more like a flawed imitation built from the ground up. Number 4, the Marathon Infinity prologue takes place after Marathon 2. This is an easy assumption to make coming off of Marathon 2. At the end of Marathon 2, the employment of the Trezime leads right into the state of affairs at the start of Infinity, but not directly. See, the use of the same weapon has unleashed a catastrophe on a universal scale in the prologue of Infinity, but it could only have occurred with at least one timeline shift along the way. There are some details that show that this is most definitely a separate timeline from all of Marathon 2. For starters, Infinity's prologue seems to continue from the manual, which describes a battle between Tefir and Durandal that began as soon as Durandal had destroyed the picket force guarding Lahoan. In this timeline, this was a trap, with Tefir waiting to attack just after. There was no landing on the planet, and Durandal was forced to retreat to Yarrow Station, leading to Tefir using the Trezime. This is a total departure from Marathon 2. Even in-game, Durandal's words imply that he never got the chance to send you to the ruins of Lahoan at all. Perhaps a more common misconception, however, is that the prologue of Marathon Infinity leads into the very next level. An understandable mistake, because your final instructions from Durandal are to reach a ship he believes is operated by Tycho, and so it's no surprise when you end up in his tender care in the next level. Besides, someone new to Infinity would have no idea that there are timelines shifting anyway. So even though you're forced into Tycho's servitude, it still seems to continue from the previous level. Closer attention will show a few issues with that, namely that Tycho is currently en route for the first time to Lahoan, in anticipation of defeating Durandal, an event that had already gone over in the prologue. Not to mention the fact that Lahoan is still a livable world with no evidence of a horrific cataclysm occurring in its sun. Most notable is the fact that Tycho even mentions that you were in his possession for the entire duration of the gap between Marathon 1 and the second chapter of Marathon Infinity. And that brings us to number 5. Each Infinity chapter is its own timeline. Infinity is not an easy game to make sense of. To be honest, I can't really pin down which levels are a part of which timeline, but some people I've talked to concluded that each chapter represents its own timeline, which makes the obvious inconsistencies with the prologue make sense because it's a chapter unto itself. However, that still leaves some problems. There are distinct breaks in the timeline between the electric sheep levels. These levels follow no pattern related to the game's chapters. On top of that, there are other seemingly random breakpoints, and even a few times that you seem to converge back on a timeline that you had previously left. Many of the levels with Tycho, be they at the start or end of the game, seem like they follow the same timeline. Overall, I'm not sure how much effort is worth putting into understanding Marathon Infinity's timeline, but suffice to say, there's no answer as easy as dividing it amongst electric sheep levels, or chapters, or anything quite so easy. Number 6, Pathways into Darkness shares its protagonist. Now there's some pretty decent evidence to suggest a connection between Pathways into Darkness and Marathon, but I'll stress that this connection is not quite as definitive as people often make it out to be. Now, there's not really any huge contradiction, as is the case when trying to link Marathon and Halo. The strongest points connecting them are that the Yarrow and something that seems a lot like a Workenkackentur are present in both stories. But that doesn't really mean a whole lot. Both the Workenkackentur and the Yarrow have reality-defying powers, so you could be getting into some weird 90s multiverse stuff here with the Yarrow warping between intellectual properties. Maybe they invaded other Bungie canon, who knows? For what it's worth, the Yarrow and Pathways are seemingly in fairly open communication, at least with the leadership of Earth, and go on to personally visit Earth to excise the Dreaming God. And while that's all surely classified, I'd expect the Yarrow to not have been said to have disappeared millions of years ago by Tycho if they had taken such an active role in Earth's relatively recent history. And while the Yarrow aren't actually totally gone in Marathon, still it would be strange for Tycho to have not referred to their relation to humanity if they were helping us kill gods in Mexico. The idea that the Yarrow were hanging out with humans after they'd left Lahoan for 1,000 years is pretty weird to me, and I think that kind of weirdness turns me away from the two games being so concretely linked. Like, what the heck were they doing in Marathon Infinity if they were that actively involved in celestial affairs? Incidentally, a lot of people take for granted that the dreaming god of Pathways into Darkness must be a Workenkackentur, but it's never called that, and they're really not that similar. What rules either is supposed to follow is pretty up in the air, so I'm not gonna say they can't be the same manner of being. Just know that this is not a given at all. So we've been building up to a lot of the connections between Pathways and Marathon being predicated on assumption. I think Bungie didn't really mean to build a strong foundation connecting the games. I think they were just having fun with their stories. That might not be as satisfying to some people as a grand mystery to dig into, but ultimately, a lot of creative decisions in gaming around that time were pretty low stakes, and amounted to some young programmer guys having fun. And these decisions weren't made with the utmost seriousness, and they didn't go through review boards or anything. Perhaps Yarrow is simply a cool sounding name, thus it was reused in Marathon. Full disclosure though, the Yarrow's connection is pretty hard to dismiss wholesale. My opposition is pretty vibes-based, something that just doesn't sit right with me, and I'm not able to refute much. And besides, that's not what I'm here to talk about with this entry. The big issue, where I definitely think people go too far, is where they suggest that the protagonists of the two games are the same man, and that is a bit crazy to me. A random US operator from the 90s ending up in Tau Ceti is a gigantic stretch. The 1990s, you know? And the evidence people use to suggest this is Battleroids being made from dead soldiers, and the security officer probably being a Battleroid, and also leaning on how Marathon invokes the concept of the universal hero in the Kill Your Television terminal. These pieces do not comprise a puzzle, in my mind. It doesn't fit together at all for me. I think that by the events of Marathon, if Pathways Man is indeed a part of this universe at all, perfectly plausible by the way, though still a bit of an assumption, he'd have been a skeleton for 200 years before anyone was making Battleroids. And I don't think they'd dig him up looking for prime soldier material by that point. Does he really fit the bill for a Battleroid just because he was a soldier who at some point presumably died? I don't think so. Could the games be in the same universe? Maybe. I might even say they probably are. Still somewhere short of definitely in my opinion, but there's absolutely no way they share a protagonist. Number 7. Thoth is a Yarrow AI. A lot of people I talk to seem to remember Thoth as being a Yarrow AI, and indeed this is what Forapedia says as of this recording. Now, Thoth's origins aren't really that deeply expounded upon. They're not spelled out. Most characters in the story assumed it was a Svit AI, and I don't see anything to contradict them. The biggest issue with Thoth being Yarrow in origin is that Thoth himself cites the Svit Kur as his creators, and I assume he'd know. You also have to wonder why the Svit Kur would have bothered to flee Lahoan if there was an AI caretaker left by the Yarrow that forcibly maintained parity between the clans of the Svit. The Yarrow who were already gone by the time the Svit Kur went to Kalia. Surely the Svit Kur would have had nothing to flee if their existence was guaranteed. It also raises the issue of why the Yarrow would have left such a thing as Thoth when they chose to entrust the Svit with their own fates. I might be wrong, but I don't really remember the game suggesting that Thoth was Yarrow made. I can see why people have that impression because he acts a lot like how you'd imagine the Yarrow to. And the Svit Kur have a very strong connection to the Yarrow as well. I posit that it is possible he's more Yarrow than Svit in a sense, because the Svit Kur resided on Kalia, the moon where the Yarrow left the keys to their wonders, and possibly it means to go wherever they went to. And this closeness the Svit Kur had to the Yarrow means that, who knows, maybe they had help making Thoth. Or maybe they used Yarrow technology the whole way. So it might not be entirely wrong to say that Thoth probably has a strong Yarrow connection. But the Yarrow were not the ones who placed him on Lahoan, that's for sure. When he says he was left behind, or when he talks of his makers, it's only in reference to the Svit Kur. Overall though, that part of the history of the Svit is shrouded in mystery. Not much is known about the origin of Thoth, nor what the Svit Kur or Yarrow did leading up to that, or during their departures. And this is probably for the best. Marathon's story is meant to be mysterious. We can't really be fully certain of where Thoth came from because hardly anyone even knew he existed. The Svit themselves came to believe that the Yarrow, meanwhile, were a myth. The tale of the 11th clan is described as a myth, not Svit historical record. Even the stuff you find about them might not be entirely accurate. The Svit had nearly forgotten the 11th clan by the time of the 4 invasion of Lahoan. The records you find pertaining to the Svit Kur are as ancient to the last free Svit as those Svit are to you. I think the cause for this misconception is that the Svit Kur aren't really as big a part of the story as the Yarrow. They were just one clan of the Svit that disappeared for a long time, and then they're back for a brief moment. Sure, they did a lot, but in a very short time period. And they're almost like a force of nature. They never talk to you or anything. Whereas the Yarrow seem to be involved in almost everything. The Four built their empire out of Yarrow technology. The Yarrow built the Svit. The Svit Kerr were saved by the Yarrow, and they might even have a connection to the Mjolnir cyborgs. They had a contingency that helps you defeat the Workenkakantur. Building Thoth seems right up their alley, so it's really easy to just say, oh yeah, that mysterious ancient AI that safeguarded the Svit was probably built by that ancient mysterious race who made the Svit and set the course for just about every other major event in the story. You know, Marathon was a fun game to talk about. It still is, but with the sequel, or whatever on the horizon, it's sure to become impossible to find these kinds of discussions about, in regards to the old games, that is. The story page may not get every little detail right all the time, but it was an interesting environment to experience, and that sort of discussion board might be one of Marathon's enduring legacies. You really didn't often see so many people coming together to discuss the stories of games on the internet in those days, and that board persisted somehow for decades. Not to rain on anyone's parade if you're looking forward to the new games, but the memory of this stuff is going to fade very quickly due to a follow-up game of the same name by the same company, a game enthusiastically being embraced by those same, still extant, ancient message boards, so that all the old discussions, and more so any new discussions about the old games, will be totally obfuscated by material about the new games. And if you don't believe me, try making a YouTube search about Marathon. You're gonna get a lot more stuff about a game that hasn't even come out yet. You know, if you don't get people running. It's already getting harder to find the old stuff, and that makes me a little sad. This video might sound like it's to rebuke people for getting the tiniest details wrong, but hey, Marathon was a game that had a story that was worth being wrong about while talking to strangers on the internet. That was really special, and I sort of want to preserve a little bit of that legacy.